Hello everyone. Tonight, we begin with a contradiction. A quiet, thorny little rule that somehow managed to be both religious and ridiculous. In the medieval world, love, if you could call it that, was often less about devotion and more about paperwork, suspicion, and court dates. Before we dive in, please like this video and subscribe to join our global community, no matter where you are. Then drop your city and local time in the comments, because your voice makes our story complete. Dim the light. Let a soft breeze whisper around you. 3, 2, 1, and settle in. Our journey into history begins now. Let's start with the biggest misconception. That people in the Middle Ages didn't talk about sex. They did. Constantly. In pulpits, in courtrooms, even in livestock barns, though rarely in bedrooms because bedrooms weren't really a thing. The church, for all its spiritual focus, was remarkably involved in married people's personal routines. And by routines, we mean exactly what you think. If a husband felt his wife was refusing to do her marital duty, he could take her to a church court and file what was called a denial of conjugal rights. Yes, there was a term for it. It wasn't considered emotional. It was a form of legal neglect. The court might issue warnings, summon witnesses, or order reconciliation, essentially urging her to resume what was expected. If she didn't comply, he could try to annul the marriage entirely. There was, oddly enough, no form for the reverse. A wife had no legal recourse if her husband avoided intimacy, unless he was impotent, and she could prove it publicly through a very awkward trial. That's one half of the puzzle. The other half? If a woman conceived too quickly after marriage, especially if it happened during the honeymoon weeks, there was a lingering suspicion that she might be using magic to hasten pregnancy. Not divine blessing, not youthful vigour, but literal sorcery. The logic was thin, but persistent. Barren couples were common, so how dare she succeed without even praying about it? One documented accusation involved a miller's wife who conceived a child before her husband even finished building their hut. The village priest declared the timeline unnatural. He meant too fast for comfort. A soft irony settled over many of these cases. Failure to bear children could lead to suspicion of sin, but success could lead to accusation of spell work. One bishop reportedly asked a midwife whether she'd seen any herbs out of place in the bedding. Some say she just smiled and said, "Only rosemary and linen, Your Grace." There were no consistent punishments. Sometimes the cases were dropped. Other times, women were fined, sent to perform penance, or, if things got ugly, banished. One woman was relocated to a nunnery for being too fertile for public life. That was the actual wording. Too fertile. One can only imagine the application form. But the contradiction went deeper. Sex in marriage was both an obligation and a threat. The church promoted marital intimacy as sacred, yet placed so many rules around it that almost any behaviour could become suspicious. Wrong position, sin, too often, sin, enjoyed it too much, dangerous. The bedroom became a courtroom in miniature, only with less privacy and more candles. Now, if you're wondering how any of this was enforced, it usually wasn't. But fear did the work. It whispered at the edges of the bed frame, echoed in sermons, and settled in the laundry baskets of village gossip. A single accusation, even if dropped, could linger for years. Some women began sleeping separately for penance. Others were married off quickly to dispel rumours. It's only mentioned once, in a scribbled note on the margin of a court ledger. But there's a record of a husband voluntarily sleeping in the barn for fear his wife might mirror Eve. No one knows what that meant. It may have been a euphemism, or a misunderstanding, or both. One medieval poem describes the ideal wife as quiet of flesh and modest in cycle. Historians still argue whether that referred to her personality or her menstrual schedule. Probably both. Somewhere between theology and superstition, the body itself became a legal paradox. Women were sacred vessels, but also potential gateways to temptation, chaos, or demonic meddling. So when they fulfilled their expected role too efficiently, it alarmed the system. Fast pregnancies made people uncomfortable. They didn't fit the rhythm of divine patience. There's a sensory image in one inquisitor's report. He describes a woman as smelling of cedar, milk, and sweatless labour. It was meant to imply unnatural ease. He filed it under evidence. Let that settle for a moment. A woman's natural scent used as proof of unnatural behaviour. And so, love, or what passed for love, lived between contradictory instructions. Do it, or else. But not too well, not too soon, not too happily, or else. Some nobles paid for fake snoring. No one asked why. The result? Marital intimacy became a space not of affection, but of legal risk. The only safe zone was somewhere between visible reluctance and perfectly average outcomes. If that sounds impossible, that's because it was. There were snoring servants, that's all. One monk, known for compiling odd bits of peasant testimony, noted that married bliss lasted exactly 4 days. After that, the neighbours started keeping records. It made sense to someone. Probably. And from these cases, quiet, tangled, uncomfortable, emerged the clearest picture of how medieval society viewed love, not as mutual desire but as a performance monitored by church, law, rumour, and occasionally, poultry. We'll get to the poultry later. Now, speaking of rules no one could follow, congratulations, you've arrived in the age of regulated affection. If you were married in medieval Europe, intimacy wasn't just between two people. It was between you, your spouse, and a long list of forbidden dates that only a bishop could love. The church had rules. Many, many rules. But none were so quietly bizarre as the calendar of permitted marital relations, hidden in plain sight inside something called penitential manuals. Guides used by confessors to advise the faithful on when, how often, and under what conditions they were allowed to touch each other. Here's the short version. If it was Friday, don't. If it was Sunday, don't. If it was a feast day, a saint's day, a fasting day, a holy week, or the day before any of those, also don't. If it was during Lent, wait 40 days. If it was during Advent, wait longer. If you'd just come from Mass, confession, or a funeral, definitely no. And if you were travelling, menstruating, or breastfeeding, the answer was unclear. So, safest to assume no. Some versions even suggested skipping Wednesdays, just in case. That left about 80 to 100 acceptable days per year, maybe less, if the priest was feeling cautious. To clarify, these restrictions weren't about health, they weren't even really about morality. They were about ritual purity, a strange spiritual math where the physical body had to obey a cosmic calendar, as if divine patience could be measured in weeks without contact. One manual from France listed appropriate nights for intimacy in the back pages, like a table of moon phases, complete with fine print about avoiding storms, eclipses and eclipses that might cause storms. It made sense to someone, and it wasn't just when you could do it, it was how. Intercourse had to be brief, non-verbal, and ideally with neither party enjoying themselves too much. Excessive motion was frowned upon. The preferred position was described in painfully vague Latin as the order of nature, unmoved by novelty, which doesn't leave much room for improvisation. One text warned that laughter during the act could open the door to demons, so could sneezing afterward. That part's still being debated by scholars, or ignored entirely. Let's be clear, these rules were rarely enforced in real life. Most peasants weren't literate, and many clergy didn't memorize every feast day, but the rules didn't need to be enforced. The threat of spiritual consequence was enough to shape behavior, or at least create unease. The church calendar became a kind of third wheel in the bedroom. It loomed. Couples didn't necessarily keep a chart, but they remembered warnings and stories and whispered examples. One peasant couple reportedly postponed their wedding 3 times because it kept falling near minuscent days. They finally gave up and eloped, then confessed. They were given 7 days of penance and told to abstain for 12 more. 12 more. There were exceptions, of course. Nobles paid indulgences, priests ignored their own advice, and monks, in private letters, sometimes questioned the logic, but only in Latin, and only using euphemisms so vague they could also apply to butter storage. But the doctrine stood. The idea wasn't to punish, it was to contain desire, to fence it in so tightly that when it was finally expressed, it had no choice but to feel like obligation, instead of instinct. In theory, this created holy unions. In practice, it created paperwork. A surviving confession ledger from 1391 lists one man's repeated sin as failure to abstain on fast days due to seasonal forgetfulness. Seasonal forgetfulness. Some say he worked with sheep. Others suggest he was just tired of remembering. A sensory detail from a confession manual. The sheets should be coarse, the air still, and the room unadorned. That's how spiritual purity was imagined, through burlap, silence, and visual austerity. No one mentioned candles, or warmth, or care. Love, as it turns out, was supposed to look like fasting. Now, you might be wondering, how did anyone have children under these rules? The answer is, they didn't always follow them, and when they did, it became mechanical, reproductive, checked against the liturgical planner. Some couples kept track by marking beans in jars, others used carved sticks. One nobleman reportedly employed a servant whose sole job was to remind him when he was permitted to touch his wife. He was called the purity steward. Some rumours say the steward later eloped with the wife. The nobleman replaced him with a calendar nailed to the bedpost. No one checked if it was accurate. And then there were the overlaps, the awkward weeks where fast days collided with feast days, or when saints shared birthdays. The manuals had little to say here. Couples were left to interpret. Interpret carefully. Some chose abstinence, others guessed. One monk wrote in a letter, "It is not the act but the timing that damns us." He later became a bishop. Eventually the rigidity softened. The Reformation swept many of these rules aside. People stopped confessing their calendars, sheets became smoother, candles returned. But for centuries love had been bent around the edges of a holy timetable. Not erased, but redirected, reworded, reduced. Until what remained was not affection, but permission. And permission could always be revoked. Now, speaking of revoked consent and required ceremonies, by now, you might be picturing medieval marriage as something private, intimate at the very least, perhaps even sacred. That would be a mistake. In the households of the nobility, weddings were anything but personal. They were performances, loud, layered, and meticulously orchestrated for display. And at the very centre of it all stood the bridal bed. Not a metaphor, a real bed, decorated, elevated, and, before anything else happened, blessed by a priest in full regalia, holding holy water. The ritual was called Benedictio Thalami, the blessing of the marriage chamber. In theory, it was a solemn invocation of fertility, fidelity, and divine favour. In practice, it often resembled a miniature coronation followed by extremely awkward loitering. The ceremony went something like this. Once the wedding mass concluded, the bride and groom were escorted, by family, retainers, and at least 2 musicians, to the chamber. There, the priest would sprinkle the bed with holy water, recite a set of prayers, and sometimes dab the bedpost with oil. Occasionally he would quote passages about fruitfulness. Often, someone would cough. Then came the audience. Because it wasn't enough to just bless the bed. It had to be witnessed. Not the act itself, usually, but the entry, the laying down, the symbolic removal of shoes. These gestures mattered because they proved the marriage had begun. Some households invited as few as 10 people, others considerably more. Records describe one 14th century bridal blessing in Toulouse, attended by over 60 guests, including 5 monks, 2 midwives, 1 falconer, and an unusually calm goat. The goat was for luck. It was not uncommon for relatives to sit in the corner of the room sipping warm ale, while the couple nervously smiled and waited for the prayers to finish. Some noble families placed coins under the mattress. Others laid out ceremonial food, roasted chestnuts, sugared almonds, or symbolic fruits. One Italian text recommends boiled leeks to encourage swift fertility. No explanation given, and yes, there are stories, rare but persistent, of certain guests lingering after the priest had left. These individuals weren't voyeurs exactly, they were guardians of tradition, or so they claimed. One German account describes a duchess's aunt remaining in the chamber to ensure modesty was preserved. She brought embroidery. In England, during the later Plantagenet period, some witnesses would bring bells, not to ring them, but to swear they hadn't heard them ring. Silence was proof. A quiet room implied respectability, or fear. Here's the strange part. None of this was considered especially odd. The more public the blessing, the more legitimate the union appeared. A quiet, unobserved wedding night could spark gossip, or worse, legal disputes about consummation. If no one saw them enter the bed, did they really enter it? One lord reportedly hired a scribe to stand outside the door and record the exact time the sheets rustled. The scribe's notes included the phrase, "activity presumed." No verbal confirmation. It made sense to someone. You might expect the church to frown on this spectacle. Sometimes it did. But often, the clergy played along. The priest's job wasn't just to bless. It was to confirm that everything aligned with doctrine, and nothing aligned better than a well-attended, slightly overlit bedding ritual. The line between sacred and social blurred. Some families even turned the event into a festival. There are records of bedding ceremonies followed by dancing, toast-giving, or puppet shows. In one bizarre French case, a puppet reenactment of the wedding night was performed before the actual couple reached the room. The bride reportedly fainted. Not from modesty, from the puppets. But not every couple found the ritual amusing. There are accounts, quiet, brief, tired, of brides weeping through the ceremony, of grooms drinking too much to cope, of servants awkwardly folding discarded garlands while side-eyeing the family dog. In one household inventory from Burgundy, a bridal towel was described as both ceremonial and used. No one clarified further. The sensory elements linger in these records. The smell of beeswax candles, the soft thump of wooden shoes, the warmth of wine gone flat. One priest noted that the room should be well swept, fragrant and devoid of sharp corners. A surprising number of medieval bedrooms had sharp corners. Some say the priest was joking, others say he was speaking from experience. And then, silence. Once the crowd dispersed, once the ale cooled and the goat was removed, the couple was alone. Alone, but not really. Their marriage now carried the weight of a witnessed expectation. The community had seen, the priest had blessed, the family had nodded, the bed had been inspected. No pressure. The assumption, of course, was that this ritual made love stronger, that it protected the couple, that it sanctified their bond. In reality, it transformed intimacy into spectacle and left very little room for genuine tenderness. It's unclear how many couples appreciated the tradition. Most probably accepted it with resignation. A few, perhaps, leaned into the absurdity. One nobleman reportedly winked at the crowd and said, "Pray for me, I won't be long." He later became a monk. And so, love, already tangled in law and schedule, became performance, watched, whispered about, confirmed. Not a moment shared, but a milestone documented. Now, speaking of milestones judged by body shape, marriage, in the medieval world, was often less about love and more about logistics, especially when it came to a woman's body. Not the heart, not the mind, just the body, measured, inspected, and quietly judged. In 12th century England, among landowning families, a girl's marital value could rise or fall based on the width of her hips. Not beauty, not kindness, not dowry, pelvic structure. Specifically whether her frame seemed suitable for childbearing, or at least suitable enough to avoid suspicion. This wasn't medical, it wasn't scientific, it was speculation dressed as theology, reinforced by superstition and whispered about during meal preparation. And yes, there were loopholes. If a girl was deemed too narrow for safe childbirth, her family could donate linen to the local church in exchange for a clerical letter reaffirming fitness. In other words, pay the parish, and your daughter becomes marriageable again. It wasn't called a bribe, it was called pious support. Some parishes accepted bolts of cloth. Others preferred finished altar linens or embroidered veils. The more ornate the stitching, the more convincing the girl's new hips became. One local priest was said to favour linen with tiny griffins in the corner. It's unclear if this had theological meaning, or he just liked griffins. One document from 1184 lists an unmarried girl as sufficient in form after donation, a phrase that somehow manages to be both hilarious and bleak. The implication? Hips could be spiritually corrected. There was no actual exam, no measuring tape. The judgment usually came from matchmakers, gossiping neighbours, or family rivals. Sometimes a midwife was consulted, though midwives were famously vague when asked to speak against a future client. It made sense to someone. What's striking is how this bodily judgment often skipped any actual experience. A girl might be 13, unmarried, untested, and still quietly labelled unfruitful by a neighbour who saw her trip over a bucket. Some say a baker's daughter was declared barren because she didn't walk with a wide enough stance. Others claim the ruling came from a bishop who'd simply had a bad week. There were no appeals. The pressure to prove fertility before marriage was everywhere. Girls were told to eat specific foods, wear certain herbs, or walk barefoot on feast days to widen the womb. These rituals had no real impact, but they kept hope alive. One folk remedy involved sitting on a warm stone while reciting Psalm 128. Another simply recommended breathing deeply and facing east. But when superstition wasn't enough, linen did the job. The linen donations were rarely refused. Churches needed altar cloths, monasteries needed robes, priests needed table runners apparently, and the idea that holiness could compensate for biology was surprisingly popular, especially among tailors. Some families turned it into tradition. Daughters approaching marriage age would begin preparing fertility cloth in advance, stitching, folding, blessing, folding again. By the time they were betrothed, the linen was ready, and so, magically, were they. There's a sensory trace here too. The crisp texture of new-washed flax, the scent of crushed lavender rubbed into seams, the soft scratch of needlework shaping griffins or lilies or saints. Somehow, this replaced medicine. Of course, not every family could afford such offerings. Poorer girls had no linen, no leverage, and no options. If deemed unfit, they remained unmarried, working as servants, joining convents, or simply disappearing from local records. Their hips never officially existed. One account mentions a girl named Isolde, labelled unsuitable by a steward. Her family offered 2 ducks instead. The priest declined. She later joined a priory and became a respected scribe, though according to one rumour, she still embroidered linen on Sundays, out of habit or spite. Perhaps both. The broader consequence was clear. Women's worth was tied to what they might produce, not who they were. A narrow pelvis meant danger, a narrow reputation meant disgrace, and no woman could argue her own case. Men could be short, bald, or odd-looking, and still marry if they had land. Women, meanwhile, were measured by how much space they seemed to offer future generations. Not love, not affection, room. It was less about family, and more about floor plans. One parish ledger lists a wedding postponed for further linen preparation. No one recorded whose hips were involved. It's tempting to laugh. But beneath the absurdity is a quiet, familiar pressure. To meet a shape you didn't choose, to be certified by people who don't know you, to smile, fold the linen, and pretend you're grateful. Some say the church eventually stopped caring about these gifts. Others believe the tradition simply evolved, replaced by subtle favours, whispered permissions or handwritten letters folded into vestments. One such letter, discovered centuries later, simply reads, "Let her marry. She is enough." Now, speaking of enough, and the things no one wanted to hear, there's a strange stillness in small villages after a wedding. The musicians have packed up, the stew has gone cold, someone's probably passed out in a ditch, and inside one of the thatched roof cottages, a new couple lies in bed, not alone, but under observation. Welcome to the bedding witness ritual. If you were a young peasant couple in medieval Europe, particularly in the 13th to 15th centuries, marriage didn't end with the ceremony. It only began after one crucial, uncomfortable, and frequently whispered about event: the public confirmation of consummation. In theory, it was about legitimacy. A marriage wasn't truly binding unless it was completed, and completion needed to be proven. In writing, number with testimony, auditory testimony. The process varied slightly by region, but the basic structure was depressingly consistent. After the feast, the couple would be escorted to the bed by family members, neighbours, or sometimes the entire village. There would be blessings, jokes, wine, occasionally a song. Then they were left alone, while 2 or more elder witnesses waited just outside the door. Their job? To listen. For evidence. Specifically, they were instructed to note sighs of union, sounds of struggle, or any audible movement that could be interpreted as success. Some took notes. One record from Yorkshire lists a man named Godric as present and attentive at 3 weddings in 1 week. He was 82. It's unclear if he volunteered, or was simply very trusted. It made sense to someone. Sometimes the witnesses would knock politely in the morning to ask if everything had gone according to plan. Sometimes they asked immediately, through the door. If the couple was quiet, there were questions. Too quiet, and the marriage might be disputed. Or worse, accused of spiritual failure. One priest warned that an unconsummated union invited demonic boredom, whatever that meant. There were even rare cases where the witnesses entered the room after the deed, ostensibly to check the sheets. Yes, that happened. The church didn't mandate these inspections officially, but it didn't exactly oppose them either. The whole idea was to discourage annulments. If someone tried to back out later, the witnesses could say, "No, we heard it. Definitely married." For the church, it was about order. For villagers, it was about gossip. For the couple, it was a test of composure. There's a story, probably apocryphal, of a bride who dropped a jug during the ritual to create a loud crash, followed by heavy breathing. The witnesses were satisfied. The jug was not. One woman in Saxony, when asked to confirm her husband's performance, reportedly said, "He tried. Then he sneezed. Then he apologized. That was apparently enough. Others weren't so lucky." In regions with higher land stakes or disputes, failure to confirm consummation could lead to annulment, or exile, or remarriage, or worse, being sent back to live with your parents. In one instance, a man was forced to reenact the bedding, fully clothed, before the local bishop to confirm alignment. Alignment. No further notes were found. The sensory details here are intimate and absurd. The crackling of firewood behind a thin wooden wall, the rustle of straw ticking beneath nervous limbs, the soft creak of a door, as someone leans just a little too close to listen. You might imagine the couple laughing about it years later, or never speaking of it again. Some say there were tricks. Crickets kept near the window, pigs encouraged to snort at the right time. A pair of newlyweds in Flanders allegedly trained their dog to bark on cue. The dog was later promoted to household guardian. One midwife wrote that some girls were coached to moan exactly once, with emphasis, followed by silence, just enough to satisfy modesty and formality. Deadpan advice, delivered with embroidery in hand. Of course, the entire practice was a strange negotiation between modesty and proof. Everyone pretended it was sacred. No one wanted to admit it was surveillance. And yet, no one refused. Because if you didn't go through with the ritual, your marriage might not count. Your children might not be seen as legitimate. Your name might be erased from inheritance lists. And so, they endured. Some couples made it a game, others made it a joke, but most simply obeyed, because the stakes were too high and the doors too thin. Eventually, these practices faded. They were mocked by reformers, erased by cities, replaced with paperwork. But the memory lingered. There's a line in a village diary from 1472. They went to bed to the sound of whispers, and rose to the smell of turnips, and were considered wed. That was enough. Now, speaking of rituals where turnips weren't the weirdest part, let's return, briefly, uncomfortably, to the medieval bedroom. Specifically, to how one was expected to behave in bed. Not because it was anyone's business, but because in medieval Spain, it very much was. According to pastoral manuals circulated among clergy, those dusty how-to guides for moral instruction, movement during sex was suspect, especially for women. A good Christian wife, it was said, should be modest, silent, and above all, still. Too much enthusiasm was linked to temptation, to sin, to Eve, and everything after. Passion wasn't seen as divine, it was seen as animal, and animals didn't get saved. So women were taught, lie back, keep quiet, and avoid initiating anything that might resemble desire. Ideally, one should close the eyes, possibly clasp the hands, and if necessary, think of scripture. One manual even advised reciting the Lord's Prayer, internally of course, during the act, just in case God was listening. But the absurdity didn't stop there. In a Castilian treatise from the late 1200s, attributed to a minor cleric who may or may not have ever been married, there appears a cautionary note. Stillness too complete invites suspicion of death. The husband must be reassured. That's an actual line, the implication. If a wife followed church advice too well, her husband might panic, It made sense to someone. Imagine the bind this created. Move too much, and you risked sin. Move too little, and you risked being mistaken for a corpse. Somewhere between arousal and rigor mortis lay virtue. Some theologians tried to clarify. One wrote that a wife could respond with gentleness, but not intention. Another allowed a soft breath or sigh, but warned against rhythm. Rhythm apparently was for heretics. There's a rumour, likely apocryphal, of a bishop who excommunicated a couple after hearing they made eye contact too long. Another insisted that women who enjoyed intimacy were harbouring the serpent in the garden. No one asked which serpent. A sensory detail appears in one confession manual. Let her eyes remain half lowered and her arms not rise. As if holiness could be choreographed like a liturgical dance, only slower, and with fewer witnesses. Probably. It wasn't all malice. Some of this advice came from genuine, if misguided, attempts to maintain dignity in a world terrified of the body. But the result was an atmosphere where even breathing was curated. Love became performance, not a duet but a solo, with one partner pretending to be asleep, or worse, pretending not to exist. One noblewoman, writing privately to a monk, asked whether she could blink during intercourse. The monk replied with 4 pages of theological hedging, followed by the words, "It depends on the season." That was the answer. It depends on the season. It wasn't just women, of course. Men had their own rules. But the scrutiny was uneven. Male passion could be forgiven as impulse. Female passion, on the other hand, suggested inner corruption, or witchcraft, or French ancestry. It depended who was judging. There's a documented case of a husband requesting annulment because his wife smiled too knowingly during their second night. The priest advised separation, pending her return to a cloister for emotional correction. She refused. He remarried. The second wife was reportedly quiet. Too quiet. Years later, the first wife wrote a devotional poem about lilies blooming in the dark. Scholars still argue what it means, but between the lines, you can almost hear the stillness. One physician attempted to bridge the gap. He wrote that moderate movement could help the humours align, but warned against any behaviour that might rouse the lower angels. No one knows what that meant. He was later fined for unauthorised medical diagrams. Another priest suggested playing a psaltery during marital acts to soothe the spirit and discourage conversation. His wife, according to records, eventually left him. With the psaltery, some women found workarounds: laughter, repackaged as coughing, shivers framed as cold, eye contact softened by candlelight, a whispered name passed off as prayer. The room became a dance of plausible deniability. You weren't enjoying it. You were simply present, but barely. The irony. These rituals of silence and restraint were often enforced in a world already full of noise, church bells, market cries, goats, and yet in the one space meant for closeness, the expectation was near catatonia. Some couples found tenderness anyway. Others drifted. A few rebelled, quietly, subtly, lovingly. But for most, love was shaped not by mutual rhythm, but by asymmetric restraint. One scribe from Toledo summarized it best. They lay together, as instructed, and when it was over, neither spoke, but both remembered. That was enough. Now, speaking of memories that involved less stillness and more oil, it's one thing to be judged in private. It's another to be judged in the town square. In early canon law, particularly from the 12th through 14th centuries, marriages could be annulled if the husband was deemed impotent, but not just impotent in rumour or reputation. It had to be proven, in court, with witnesses, and sometimes, God help everyone involved, with demonstrations. These were known, formally, as impotence trials, and they were exactly as undignified as they sound. The process typically began when a wife petitioned the church, claiming her husband was unable to fulfill the marital duty. The court would hear her case. If the accusation seemed credible, and if the husband didn't simply disappear into a monastery, the next step was examination, public, medical, and collaborative. A panel would be assembled, often consisting of 2 or more midwives, a clergy representative, and at least one secular figure to preserve civic neutrality. In some towns that meant the local crier, A man whose normal job was to announce sheep auctions or bread taxes, now suddenly tasked with observing anatomical performance. It made sense to someone. The examination wasn't always invasive, but it was always humiliating. In some regions, the man was expected to display his ability in a private room with observers outside. In others, there was no room. One documented case from southern France involved a man required to attempt arousal in front of a panel of 5, including his wife's uncle and the bishop's valet. He fainted before removing his belt. The court ruled against him. Another record from Flanders notes that the subject was of sound body but cold spirit. That's not poetry. That's a diagnosis. There was occasionally a physical test, herbal salves, warm compresses, friction methods. If he responded, he passed. If not, the marriage could be dissolved. His lands might revert. His social standing, not so much. The most infamous case comes from Naples, where a nobleman undergoing examination reportedly shouted, "This is not the time," and was told by a monk, "God sees all times as equal." He was later granted exile. Some say he left by night, carrying only a hat and a bottle of vinegar. No one knows why. Now, you might think this level of scrutiny was rare. It wasn't. Especially when money or titles were involved. A wife unable to bear legitimate heirs could threaten a family's legacy. So proving that the husband was at fault became essential. And so, rooms were cleared, candles lit, juries assembled. The irony. Love had nothing to do with it. There's a sensory echo in many of these accounts. The scratch of quills on parchment as notes were taken, the soft shuffle of ecclesiastical robes, the dry cough of someone pretending not to look. One midwife reportedly brought knitting, another asked if refreshments would be provided. In some towns, the accused could request a substitute trial, a form of consummation by proxy involving certified consorts. Yes, those existed. Think of them as temporary legal test subjects. They were sworn to honesty, compensated modestly, and rarely asked twice. One such woman testified, "He made effort, but not result." That line appears in 3 separate ledgers. Sometimes the accused men offered alternative explanations. Curses, diet, bad weather. A merchant once blamed damp wool fumes. A fisherman blamed the tide. No one believed him, but it rained that day, and the court adjourned early. The church didn't revel in this process, but it upheld it, because legitimacy mattered more than dignity, and truth, apparently, was worth exposing. Literally. The outcomes varied. Some men were cleared, others annulled, a few exiled in silence. A handful were reassigned to faraway monasteries, where they spent their remaining years copying psalms and avoiding eye contact. There's a letter, unsigned, unaddressed, found in a monastery wall centuries later. It reads, "They asked me to prove I could love. I froze. Now I light candles for those who still have to try." It's unclear who wrote it. But the ink had bled. Over time, the practice faded. The Renaissance softened the edges. Privacy crept in. But the stories lingered. Quiet, fragile, absurd. One town crier later admitted he never spoke of the trials again, except once, in a tavern, where he toasted to things better left unseen, and that was that. Now, speaking of marriages judged by belts and belts judged by saints, let's shift from trials to textiles, from exposed anatomy to exposed fashion choices. In many medieval market towns, clothing wasn't just about function, it was about message, and sometimes a misinterpreted message could ruin your life. Enter the red belt. By the 14th century, towns across Western Europe, especially in England, France and parts of the Low Countries, had developed a quiet but persistent code. Unmarried women were discouraged from wearing red accessories, most notably belts. The reasoning? Red symbolized lust, desire, the Magdalene. It was too suggestive, too bold, too much like saying, without words, "Yes, I'm available." Except, that wasn't always the case. Some widows simply reused fabric. Some girls inherited sashes. Some market vendors stitched what dye they could afford. And red was cheap when mixed from clay-based pigment. Still, rumours clung to colour like mud to boots. An unmarried woman wearing a red belt might be stopped, questioned, even reported to the parish clerk. In one documented case, a baker's daughter in York was summoned before a moral tribunal for wearing crimson threading while unspoken for. The panel included a priest, a glove maker, and 2 elderly weavers. She claimed the belt was from her late aunt. The priest asked if the aunt had lived righteously. She replied, "She made cheese and died of gout." No further comment was recorded. It made sense to someone. The tension between fabric and reputation was real. Clothing wasn't just a covering, it was a contract. Modesty was expected to be readable. Palettes were policed. Hems were signals. One town even banned green cloaks on unmarried women during spring festivals, for reasons no one could explain, but everyone obeyed. There's a strange weight in fabric history. A line from a city ordinance reads, "Let no maid under the Lord's roof adorn herself in tones of temptation." Tones of temptation. One poor girl in Bruges was fined a week's wages for wearing a pink sash that had faded in the wash. Another was accused of harbouring intent simply because her belt matched her boots. No one asked if it was laundry day. Even practicalities didn't matter. Red was a durable colour. It didn't show wine stains or meat juices. Market workers preferred it. But preference didn't matter when morality sniffed at the edge of every hemline. Some women adapted. They turned belts inside out, dyed them again with vinegar. One clever widow in Ghent embroidered tiny white lilies along her red sash and claimed it was a devotional item. When asked what saint required a belt, she smiled and said, "The one who understands widows." No further action was taken, but not all were so lucky. A tailor's apprentice in Rouen was reportedly denied marriage because his bride was seen wearing ruby braid 3 times in 1 month. The wedding was delayed. The braid was burned. Some say the colour rules were invented by tailors themselves, trying to boost sales of neutral fabrics. Others blame overzealous monks with too much free time and too little sense of nuance. The truth probably lies somewhere between linen and suspicion. There's a sensory image in one trial note. Her belt shimmered in sun and drew glances from cartmen. That was offered as evidence, not of seduction, just of attention. But attention, it seemed, was crime enough. In a world where love was restricted, bodies controlled and movement surveilled, colour was rebellion. Tiny, stitched, foldable. You could hide it in your satchel, slip it on after church, remove it if needed. Red was portable defiance, or accidental defiance, or simply red. And yet, the belt wasn't always the cause. It was the excuse. When people whispered about a girl's virtue, the belt became proof. When a man felt embarrassed, the belt became threat. When someone needed to justify cruelty, the belt did the talking. It's only mentioned once, in a side note on a court ledger, but a judge reportedly said, "Let her change her belt or change her path." The belt was not the problem. She left the village. Centuries later, the belt survives. Not physically, but in embroidery patterns, in folk songs, in whispered stories about the girl who wore red and wasn't afraid. There's even a line in a lullaby from Provence. "Wrap her waist in cloth of fire, she'll burn through any vow." It was probably a metaphor, or not. Now, speaking of vows, and what happened when fabric wasn't enough to hide them, at first glance medieval monasteries appear timeless, silent, and invulnerable to distraction. Stone walls, cold floors, chanting voices, a disciplined rhythm of prayer, copying and reflection, everything in its place. But between the lines, literally, something else stirred. In remote monasteries across Europe, from the cliffs of Ireland to the forests of Bohemia, monks sometimes scribbled poetry in the margins of their sacred texts. Not just notes, not just prayers, but fragments of longing, and not for God, for angels. Some of the earliest examples date to the 11th and 12th centuries. Short stanzas, barely legible, nestled between verses of psalms or beside theological commentaries. The writing was small, slanted, and often personal. A line about a shimmering wing, a phrase about golden hair in the chapel light, a plea for return. They called them angelic meditations. Modern scholars call them suspicious. Because for all their talk of divine beauty, the tone often feels intimate. One monk wrote, "I dreamed the angel spoke my name. No trumpet, just breath." Another asked, "Do angels tire of silence too?" And the clincher, Many of these verses were found in pairs, echoes between two different hands. One would write, another would respond. Two voices, one margin, no signatures. It made sense to someone. Of course, the church discouraged romantic longing of any kind. Monks took vows of chastity, obedience, poverty. Their lives were to be ruled by devotion, not desire. But the monastery wasn't a vacuum. These men lived together for decades, ate together, sang together, fell ill, recovered, aged. And somewhere in all that repetition, the line between fellowship and feeling blurred. So, they wrote, not openly, not in confession, but in margins, small spaces where longing could hide. There's a famous example from a Czech monastery. Two monks exchanging verses across the pages of a Latin hymnal over several years. One writes, "The angel watches you sleep." A month later, another replies, "The angel stayed until morning." The manuscript survives. The authors do not. Some believe these poems were coded declarations, veiled expressions of affection between monks, disguised in language too sacred to question. Others argue they were simply devotional exercises taken too far, and maybe they were, but the emotion is real, the restraint is obvious, and the fact that the words were hidden speaks louder than any explanation. One scholar noted, "They obeyed with their bodies, but not with their ink." The sensory image is striking. Cold ink on warm vellum, quills dipped in secret, a flick of the eye before the abbot returns, the soft hush of turning pages. Love, if you can call it that, reduced to smudges and initials, and sometimes drawings. A few manuscripts include faint sketches, wings, halos, doves. One includes a full miniature of two robed figures standing too close to be accidental. Another shows a single candle burning beside an open book, with the caption, "He read by my light." It was filed under decorative marginalia. In a monastery in northern England, a monk was reportedly disciplined for excessive ornament in sacred volumes. His books contained an unusually high number of angelic references. The margin verses stopped after that. The silence is visible, but not all orders reacted harshly. Some quietly ignored these writings. A few abbots even preserved them. One codex contains the note, "Let their words remain, if not their names." It's unclear if the note was an act of mercy or subtle admiration. There are even folk stories passed down. Tales of two monks who fell in love but never touched, never spoke aloud, only left words in each other's psalters. One version ends with them buried side by side. Another says the margins were burned. Neither can be verified, but the poems remain, and you can feel the tension between duty and softness, between silence and signal. Love, compressed into a space no wider than a thumbprint. Sacred text framing something far more dangerous than heresy. Attachment. Not lust, not scandal, just the quiet risk of care. One margin reads, "If I were more holy, I'd forget you, but then you'd forget me too." That line has no attribution, but someone wrote it. Someone who prayed 6 times a day, copied scripture by candlelight, and still left a whisper for someone else to find. We can't know what these men meant. Maybe they truly saw angels. Maybe they only pretended. Maybe pretending was the safest way to feel something without breaking anything. But in a world that criminalized touch and erased affection, a scribbled stanza could be everything. One monk at the very end of a worn breviary added a single phrase. He never spoke. But he always looked up when I entered. Now, speaking of looking up, and the things people gave in exchange for it. Forget flowers, forget poetry, forget the romantic image of a man on horseback, riding through Burgundy with a jewel box and trembling declarations. In medieval Burgundy, if you truly loved someone, you gave them fat. If things were serious, you added tongue, not your own, a cured one, wrapped in linen. Because in this corner of 14th century France, courtship was as much about sustenance as sentiment. Lovers expressed devotion not through grand gestures or stolen glances, but through meat, salt, and stomach logic. The traditions varied by village, but the rules were oddly consistent. Salted lard represented stability, prosperity, and long-term provision. Cured tongue meant loyalty, careful speech, and a promise not to talk behind one's lover's back. A gift of both was considered an informal betrothal unless returned unconsumed. It made sense to someone. A young man, hoping to express admiration, might send a modest square of pork fat, neatly salted and stitched into a cloth. If she accepted, the cloth would be returned days later with a dried tongue enclosed. Beef, lamb, or occasionally goose, depending on region and budget. If she returned the cloth empty, the answer was no. If she returned only the tongue, it meant, "I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm not ready to commit to your stomach." In a few cases, girls kept the lad but claimed they never received the tongue. Disputes were common. At least 2 parish records from Dijon document engagements delayed over meat miscommunication. There's a preserved note from 1386 where a village elder was asked to mediate a love dispute. He claims she devoured the fat without reply. She claims the fat was unworthy of salt. He ruled in her favour. The boy cried. The girl married someone else, possibly a man with better pigs. But it wasn't just symbolic. These gifts mattered. Salted fat was survival. Cured meat was currency. In a world where winters were brutal and protein scarce, to offer someone your preserved food was to say, "I would rather be hungry than see you go without." It wasn't just romance, it was risk. That made it powerful, intimate, a little greasy. Some families kept a courtship cupboard, where daughters stored cured offerings, tokens of interest wrapped in cloth, sometimes labelled, sometimes not. There's a letter from a mother in bone warning her daughter, "Keep the lard of Pierre, but throw out Jacques. His meat spoiled quickly." Whether she meant the man or the pork is unclear. The tongue, too, carried layers of meaning. Some said it symbolised the promise to speak kindly. Others believed it represented a willingness to listen, to refrain from gossip or to control one's passions in public. There's a folk tale about a girl who accepted 3 tongues from 3 different men and was cursed to speak in riddles forever. In another story, a man sent a cow tongue spiced with rosemary, and the girl wrote back, "Too forward, I am not a widow." Subtlety mattered. An especially romantic suitor might score the tongue with initials. One girl, in a gesture recorded in a 1411 ledger, embroidered a red thread down the centre of a returned tongue, symbolising shared burden. In contrast, a bitter rejection could be sent by returning the fat melted, wrapped in a scrap of wet wool. One rejected boy reportedly tried to rebrine it and send it to someone else. His sister stopped him. His name was later found carved into a tavern wall with the phrase, "Undercured and over-hopeful." Church authorities were wary. Fat had a sensual implication they didn't like. Tongue was even worse, symbolically dangerous, especially when passed between unmarried hands. One bishop banned meat exchange entirely during Lent, claiming it incited carnal thoughts and digestive sin. A monk in Auxerre preached against seasoned courtship, saying it led to more spiced births come harvest. He was ignored. The church's real concern wasn't the gifts, it was the autonomy. These tokens were traded without priests, parents, or permission. They were intimate, immediate, and unregulated. Love, reduced to bites of salt and intention, was hard to control. Still, the tradition endured. One merchant's daughter reportedly stored every gift she ever received, then boiled them all into a stew when she finally accepted a proposal. She fed it to the groom on their wedding night. He called it complicated but moving. There's something deeply human here. In a time when parchment was expensive, when literacy was low and love letters could be mistaken for witchcraft, people still found ways to say, "I care." They said it with preserved fat. They said it with salted tongue. They said it through meat that would outlast storms, taxes, and family disapproval. Because even in a world full of strict rules, sharp hunger, and moral inspection, love still had a taste. And sometimes, that taste was briny, chewy, and a little too rich, but it was offered anyway. One diary fragment from 1432 reads, "He gave me lard wrapped in linen. I unwrapped it slowly, as if it were silk." Now, speaking of wrappings, and the way women braided their hair to avoid taxation, in 15th century Germany, in cities with names heavy as beer mugs, Augsburg, Nuremberg, Ulm, regulations were precise, public, and profoundly odd. There were taxes for salt, taxes for windows, taxes for singing after dark, and for women who worked in the city brothels, there were taxes for how they wore their hair. The law was clear. A woman who wore her hair in braids signalled that she was open for full service. She paid the full tax. A woman with her hair loose was taken to imply she had not confessed or was unclean, unavailable until absolution. She was temporarily exempt from the tax but marked for inspection. Covered hair, in certain districts, was interpreted as either retirement, mourning, or a holy day exception. But even then, the tax record kept her on file, just in case. It made sense to someone. City ledgers list these payments in the same tone they use for cobblers, bakers, and fishmongers. The most common entries show paid in full, 2 braids, declared clean, sex pfennig, loose hair, unpaid, referred to confessor, pending report. Hair in these ledgers replaced the need for signage or speech. It became a visual permit, and in this system, braids meant business. The origins are bureaucratic. Local governments, always in search of revenue, realised they could not only register sex workers but categorise them at a glance. Hair was perfect, visible, variable, and impossible to fake on short notice. Women working legally were required to display their status. In some cities, specific braid styles were mandated, a double plait wrapped in red thread or a single braid tied with a brass pin. Non-compliance resulted in penalties, not prison, but fines. One ordinance from Augsburg reads, "Let the women of profession mark themselves in braid, that the collectors may know whom to tax and whom to send to the priest." Collectors did not enter brothels, they watched from the street. Hair became surveillance, braid meant availability. Loose hair, too much looseness, and you risked being labelled out of order. It created a strange kind of public performance. Women braided themselves not just for hygiene or beauty, but for fiscal categorization. A tight braid was more than decoration. It was a business declaration, and a protective shield against misinterpretation. But it also left no room for ambiguity. A woman walking to the bakery in braids might be assumed available, even when she wasn't working. A woman running errands with her hair down might be mistaken for devout or ill. One recorded complaint from Regensburg describes a tax officer fining a woman because her hair appeared orderly enough to indicate intention. Her response, "I had not braided. It was just windy." She lost the appeal. Some women resisted with subtle rebellion. They wore half braids, twists that mimicked order, but defied classification. Others invented rest day braids, intentionally uneven plaits to signal unavailability without drawing church attention. Hair became a code book, left braid tight, right braid loose. Recovering from illness, not working today. Both braids tied with black thread equals mourning, but still accepting regulars. No braid, but a visible comb tucked behind the ear equals available, but only until Vespers. There are even records of women using ribbon colours to signal confession status. Green for cleared, white for pending, red for don't ask. A whole unspoken system, all balanced on the head. But not everyone read the signs correctly. Clergy often complained about the ambiguity. One bishop described the hair code as a tangle of temptations. His successor proposed mandatory veils for all working women, to remove the guesswork. The council declined, too expensive and unpopular with tax collectors. Besides, they argued, the system worked. Taxes were up, streets were orderly, and the public could easily tell who was available, who was sinning, and who was in confession. Hair made women legible, to men, to the law, and to God. Or at least to the man who filed tax receipts. What's striking isn't the absurdity, it's the normalcy. For many women, this was simply how life functioned. You braided to declare your status, you unbraided to pray, you wore your intentions and your sins on your scalp. There's something painfully efficient about it. Also something painfully familiar. Because it's always the same story, isn't it? When women are visible, they are legible. When legible, they are taxable. When taxable, they are controlled. By hair, by eyes, by systems pretending to be orderly. One tax clerk in Ulm left this entry in a side margin. She braided cleanly, paid in advance, looked at me like I was dust. He underlined it twice, and maybe that's the real reason for the braids. Not regulation, not revenue. but the desperate bureaucratic attempt to hold a little power over the women who wouldn't look away. Now, speaking of gazes, and one woman in Florence who said her husband loved her too much. In 14th century Florence, most love stories never made it to court. They ended quietly, in marriage, in betrayal, in the blackened footnotes of family ledgers. Love was not a legal matter, unless it got suspicious. That's what happened in the case of Maddalena G., a woman who told the court her husband had bewitched her into loving him too much. It began with a complaint, not from the man, from his wife. According to the transcript preserved in the Archivio di Stato di Firenze, Maddalena appeared before a civic tribunal, calm and trembling. She claimed that her feelings toward her husband had taken on an unnatural intensity. She said she woke thinking of him. She said her hands shook when he entered the room. She said her appetite was ruined when he was gone. At first, the judges laughed, but then she added, "This affection, I cannot remove it, though I pray, though I confess, though I beat my chest and beg the Virgin. It is not normal. It was placed there." They stopped laughing. To the 14th century legal mind, love was not inherently innocent. It could be engineered, forced, even cast. The Church taught that true love must be moderated, channeled within marriage, quiet, reproductive. A wife who desired too strongly, too openly, was suspect, especially if she blamed him for it. Maddalena testified that her husband, Giovanni, had performed small rituals. He had burned herbs in their bedchamber. He murmured Latin phrases she didn't recognize. Once, he had kissed the soles of her feet and whispered, "Now, you are mine completely." This, she said, was when the spell took hold. The judges asked if he had ever forced her physically. "No," she replied. Had he mistreated her? No. Had he failed in his duties? Never. He is perfect. Which in Florence was perhaps the most damning thing a husband could be. The case should have been thrown out. Instead, the judges consulted clergy. A Dominican friar agreed to examine Maddalena, not her body, but her prayers, her calendar of confession. He returned with a short report. The woman is devout, but deeply afflicted by affection. The court convened again. One judge suggested temporary separation. Another asked whether Giovanni's mother had any history of folk magic. A third requested a list of the herbs used in their home for botanical review. In the margins of the record, one judge scribbled, "He kissed her feet. Curious." There is no record of Giovanni being summoned. He was never questioned. The matter officially was closed. No evidence of maleficia. The affection is inconvenient, not criminal. But the notes continue. 1 month later, the same judge who dismissed the case copied a short passage from it into a personal notebook. It read, "She weeps when he leaves and cannot eat when he is far. She says his voice interrupts her sleep and she does not wish to stop it." He underlined that line. The case became a whisper, a caution, a joke sometimes among clerks. The woman who loved too much, the man who bewitched his wife by being attentive, tender, and possibly literate. Years later, a notary in Bologna referred to pulling a Giovanni when discussing a client who wrote poems to his wife. And Maddalena? She vanishes from the record. No further complaints, no annulment, no death, no miracle. We only know she said, "I tried to stop loving him. I failed. Something is wrong." And for that, the system had no real category. Because here's the thing. Florence had rules for infidelity, for abandonment, for cruelty, even for excessive lust, but not for devotion that couldn't be explained. Not for love that arrived too suddenly, too wholly, and refused to leave. There were laws against seduction, yes, but none against sincerity that didn't feel like her own. In the end, the state didn't punish her, but it didn't help her either. Because to them, the danger wasn't her husband. The danger was the idea that a woman might love someone so deeply, so inexplicably, that it looked like sorcery. There's a note, possibly apocryphal, in one clerk's private archive. It reads, "She cried as she left," not because they dismissed her, but because no one believed that love could feel like an invasion. Now, speaking of invasions, and the strange treatments recommended for heartsick villagers. In the medical manuscripts of late medieval Europe, Love was classified not as passion or poetry, but as imbalance, a misalignment of fluids, an overheating of the liver, an agitation of the humours caused by gazing too long at someone's elbows. It was called amorherios, lovesickness, and it was real, at least real enough to merit treatment protocols in the same pages as gout, night terrors, and sheep bites. If the patient was a man, the treatment was clear. Leeches, to the neck, the wrist, sometimes the inner thigh, sometimes just one, sometimes a brace, 2 leeches working in tandem. The goal, reduce pressure, lower the pulse, drain the blood. If he had been sighing too often, reading too many troubadour poems or refusing mutton, leeches. If his eyes seemed wet without reason, leeches. If he composed a song, 2 leeches. Leeches were considered both a medical cure and a moral reset. They quieted the body and, allegedly, the imagination. A physician's note from 1382 reads, "When the blood is removed, so too the fantasy may quiet." But if the patient was a woman, everything changed. Not because the disease was different, but because the body was. Women, physicians insisted, could not suffer true lovesickness. They suffered from excess warmth of the womb, or wandering desire, which required no leeches. Instead, it required marriage, or failing that, prayer. Marriage was the medieval version of clinical suppression. If a girl pined too much, the doctor recommended she be matched, quickly, legally, and preferably to someone with steady income and good calves. This was not about affection. It was about closing the loop, reducing the fluttering, containing the spread. There are cases where a woman was married to avoid further symptoms. The marriage was sometimes expedited within days. A medical treatise from 1404 says, "If the maiden dreams nightly of one man's face, it is best she be joined to another, that the mind may reset through repetition." In other words, if she's obsessed, marry her to someone else, fast. It made sense to someone. If marriage was not an option, because of class, dowry, scandal, or war, then prayer was prescribed. Not gentle prayer, directed prayer, aggressive, sweaty, kneeling until bruised prayer, usually to the Virgin Mary, sometimes to St. Dymphna, patron of mental distress, rarely to St. Valentine, who was widely considered too soft. The afflicted woman was told to fast, to avoid lace, to stop touching fabric unnecessarily, and to recite out loud, "Let my heart submit to stillness." In some convents, this line was chanted in groups, for rhythm and shame. The absurdity wasn't in the diagnosis, it was in the double standard. Men could suffer extravagantly, write poems, faint, wander the hills, get bled, and be called tragic. Their longing was literary. But a woman with flushed cheeks and restless sleep, she was either needy, sinful, or ripe for capture. A monk physician in Mainz wrote, "A man overcome by love must be bled. A woman overcome by love must be married. If neither is done, she may begin to write poems. This must be stopped." That line has been copied, many times, rarely with irony. Of course, some women refused the remedies. There's a record of a girl in Flanders who denied all suitors and was prescribed a leech anyway. When asked how she felt after, she said, "Less blood, same ache." There's another case in Savoy of a widow who requested leeches to forget a boy. The doctor laughed. The woman didn't. Eventually, treatments evolved. By the late 15th century, lovesickness was categorized as mental disturbance. But even then, gendered care persisted. One late manuscript lists, for men, wine, bloodletting, cold baths. For women, confession, holy water, new fabrics. As if changing one's dress might erase longing. As if sin could be stitched out by thread count. Still, one wonders. What if they had tried the opposite? What if women were given the leeches, and men told to marry strangers, or pray until they forgot how music worked? Would anything have changed? Would the ache have eased? Or would love have found its way back through the cracks, through songs hummed while kneading dough, through stitched initials in cuffs, through prayers whispered not to the Virgin, but to the memory of someone's mouth? One manuscript ends with a note from a village healer. It reads, "She did not get better, but she married. I suppose that counts." Now, speaking of counting, and the tales where love caused storms, blight and rot. Long before love was whispered behind windows or buried in court records, it was warned about. In folk tales told to children, around fire pits, under patchy thatch, beside pots of cooling broth, love was rarely the prize. It was the cause of storms, of madness, of crop failure, especially turnips. One folk tale from Western Saxony opens with a farmer's daughter who falls in love with a flax merchant. She offers him a ribbon. He offers her a seed. That night, a storm tears through the valley and rips the roof off the chapel. Lesson: keep your seeds to yourself. In another tale from Alsace, a boy kisses a girl during Advent. The next week the turnips go soft, and 3 goats miscarry. The girl is sent to her aunt in Lorraine. The boy becomes a priest. The town stops dancing for a decade. Lesson: kiss in spring, not before Christ is born. These weren't obscure superstitions. They were stories told regularly, by parents, by neighbours, by wet nurses with only 4 teeth but terrifying authority. The structure was always similar. Someone loves wrongly. Nature responds violently. The community suffers. The resolution involves banishment, death, or never marrying again. The connection between love and ecological disaster was deeply embedded. Storms were blamed not on weather patterns, but on glances exchanged too often. Floods were linked to unchaperoned walks. If someone eloped, the next frost was on them. One tale describes a girl who tied a boy's hair ribbon around her wrist. The next morning the grain store collapsed. When asked why, her grandmother whispered, "That's what happens when you bind yourself before the harvest." But the most cursed crop of all? The turnip. Turnips were simple, cheap, and prone to rot. When they failed, people noticed. When they failed after someone confessed to loving the miller's son, people connected the dots. In Bavarian folk tales, a failed turnip season could be traced to premature hand-holding, touching lips after shared mead, lovers, laying too close on consecrated ground. One rhyme goes, "If turnips rot and love is near, the fault is in the girl, my dear." Girls got the blame, always, and yet, none of these tales ever blamed plumbing or rot or simple bacterial decay. Mould wasn't discussed, soil imbalance wasn't suspected. No one said, "It rained too much," or "We stored them badly." They said, "Someone loved without permission." It made sense to someone, because plumbing couldn't be warned against. Plumbing didn't giggle in the dark or pass notes behind ale barrels. Love could be controlled, or punished trying. Of course, these stories weren't really about vegetables. They were about containment. If love could be linked to disaster, then it could be managed, discouraged, delayed. If love meant risk, then children might keep quiet until the harvest came in. In one tale, a girl speaks to a boy during Lent and the church well goes dry. She weeps. The boy apologizes. A nun buries his shoes. Water returns in May. The lesson is not subtle, but sometimes the story's cracked. In rare versions, the lovers flee before the blight arrives, or the storm hits a different village, or the turnips rot regardless, and the villagers start to wonder. One storyteller in 1480 wrote, "The boy kissed the girl and no storm came, but they were scolded anyway." Another tale ends with, "The turnips failed, though no one had touched." That's the dangerous part. Not the kiss, not the love, but the moment people realize that blight comes for everyone, even the pure, even the alone. Because deep down, these tales were trying to do 2 things. 1, make love feel like danger. 2, make danger feel explainable. If a storm is just a storm, it's terrifying. But if it's punishment for kissing during rogation week, then at least it means something. If love is powerful enough to ruin crops, maybe it's worth fearing, maybe even worth trying. There's a record of a girl in Swabia who, when warned that loving the cooper's son would bring mildew to the village grain, replied, "Then let the grain go hungry. I'm tired of chewing without sweetness." She married him. The turnips rotted anyway. So did the pipes. But no one blamed those. Now, speaking of records, and the men who erased love not for morality but for budget. By the 16th century, the pillars of feudal law were cracking. Kings now consulted accountants. Lords bowed to merchants. Even peasants, those who could afford shoes, began quoting prices before oaths. In this shifting world of paper and power, one quiet detail began to vanish. Love. Not from life, from records. In the margins of ledgers, in the back pages of court archives, in those brittle sheets bound with string and dust, you sometimes find faint outlines. Ink erased, lines recopied, paragraphs missing entirely. And if you're careful and trained in the way of dry parchment and wet history, you might notice what was once there. Not crimes, not confessions, not laws, but letters. Letters of affection, of yearning, of apology or desperation, or, once, a proposal scrawled into a witness report. All gone, erased, not for shame, not for secrecy, but because parchment was expensive and love took up too much room. A single sheet of calfskin vellum could cost more than a day's wage. It had to be cleaned, stretched, dried, scraped smooth. It came in grades. The best pages were used for royal treaties, military orders, tax reforms. The lesser ones for marriage licenses and wool disputes. Love letters, unofficial, undemanded, were written in the margins or between lines or on the backs of depositions. A scribe, bored or moved, would slide in a phrase, "Tell her I pray for her still." He wore blue when he left, and I cannot forget the sound of the latch. I have not touched another. They weren't meant for the court, but they ended up in the archive anyway, until someone noticed. As bureaucracy hardened, efficiency became virtue. The new scribes were paid by page, not sentiment. They were told to transcribe laws, not feelings. One clerk in Toulouse was reprimanded for including a footnote about a kiss. Another in Ghent had his pay docked for copying a non-binding fondness into a land dispute. The solution came quietly. Erase the margins, reuse the parchment, leave no trace. Sometimes this was literal, scraped with pumice, the ink lifted gently like smoke. Other times they simply wrote over it. Love became palimpsest. One surviving folio from a Bohemian court shows a tax dispute between cousins. Beneath it, visible only under angled light, is the faint outline of a line. She asked me if I meant it. I still do. The tax matter was resolved. The love was overwritten. It made sense to someone, but not everyone obeyed. Some scribes hid what they could. By shrinking the letters into flourishes, by tucking notes between ink blots, by encoding names inside abbreviations that looked legal, but weren't. There's a court log from Silesia where the word cattle is repeated 19 times in a single paragraph. Under each C, an indent, a code. When decoded it reads, "Come back." No one noticed. Or maybe they did, and understood. It's tempting to mourn these lost letters as tragedy. But maybe they were never meant to last. Maybe the scribes knew. Love, recorded, becomes argument. Love, erased, becomes memory. And memory is cheaper than parchment. By the time centralized law took hold and archives became formal, the margins were mostly clean, the loops less curly, the passion reduced to "see attached document" or "consent witnessed by father and clerk." But sometimes, if you hold a page to the light or run your finger along an oddly worn line, you still feel it. The shape of a sentence meant for someone's eyes, not God's. A word written not to testify, but to remain. Not because love was scandalous, but because vellum costs coin and ink was not infinite. And perhaps the greatest proof of devotion was not what lovers said, but what someone risked writing down, even knowing it might be scrubbed away by the next man with a sponge and a deadline. Now the record ends. The parchment dries. The scribes have gone home. The court has closed. But love, of course, always ignores closing arguments. By now you've met them all. The woman whose hips were doubted by priests. The husband on trial for what didn't rise. The monk who loved in margins. The girl who wore red. The saint who whispered vows to carved wood. None of these people believed they were in a romance. They were just trying to survive love in a world where love had rules. Heavy ones, holy ones, public ones. Rules about volume, about belts, about bloodlines and posture and whether or not you breathed too much while being blessed. For most of them, love wasn't a choice. It was a contract, signed by parents, sealed by clergy, witnessed by goats, and yet they still tried. They tried to smuggle tenderness between lines of scripture. They tried to thread defiance into linen hems. They tried to sigh just loud enough behind a door. They tried to believe that longing could be holy. They tried above all not to be alone. That's the real story, not the castles, not the tournaments, not the sonnets carved into tree bark by men who bathe twice a year, but the quiet, shivering effort to feel something real, in a time when every feeling was either sin, scandal, or scribbled over. So when you hear someone say medieval romance, remember, sometimes it meant letters in Latin, sometimes it meant livestock at your wedding, sometimes it meant silence, and sometimes it meant marrying a crucifix because no one else could love you without consequences. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was true, and maybe that's the most romantic thing of all.